That's a really powerful thing to know here, that behaviour symbolises a need. So if it's for ourselves, if we are really aware in those moments, we can ask ourselves or catch ourselves and check ourselves, what do I need right now? And if it's happening with someone else in our world, we can ask the same.
When I feel vulnerable, the thing that I want is to feel connection. The thing that I want is to know that I matter, to know that I belong, to know that I'm safe, whatever it might be. And by getting busy or cracking jokes and forcing that moment away or delaying the vulnerability, it actually pushes away connection. It pushes away the thing that I might need in that moment.
I always convinced myself that if someone bullied me and I owned that story and I laughed about it with them, then I win.
We know what it's like to take risks. That's how vulnerability is really defined, as a time when you are either emotionally exposed, or there is risk, or there is uncertainty.
Podclass acknowledges the true and traditional custodians of the land we meet on here today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and are grateful to be on this country.
So no one told you teaching was gonna be this way. Your lesson plans are jokes, your patience broke, you're feeling in disarray. It's like you're always stuck in report writing, when it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your school year. But I'll be here for you
When the students start to riot,
I'll be here for you,
even if your coffee's gone cold.
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Podclass, the podcast for teachers, educators, basically anyone who works with young people. You are joined, as always, by your hosts, Skye, that's me, and Amanda,
That's me.
and our dear friend, Wil Massara.
G'day.
And collectively, we are the co-founders of Youth Engagement Project and Youth Leadership Academy Australia.
It's a mouthful.
It is mouthful, as long as
There's a lot of youth
in there.
I'm glad we're here talking about young people.
And this is the one about being vulnerable.
Here we are. What a topic.
And if that feels a little bit scary, or there's like all of a sudden a little bit of a shift in your energy,
Everyone's butt cheeks just clenched on their drive to work today. Like,
Yeah.
welcome to the party.
And yeah, I feel like, we witness our young people show vulnerability all of the time. And we also know how it feels to be vulnerable, and we know what it's like to take risks. And, that's how vulnerability is really defined. It's really defined as a time when you are either emotionally exposed, or there is risk, or there is uncertainty. And I think what we need to get really real about is that happens all the time, and not just for our students, for us.
Yeah.
Like, how often are we emotionally certain exactly how things are going to unfold, and there is zero risk? Like, on my couch at home watching TV.
Yeah.
Like, that's basically like, there are those elements as we grow, as we share, as we are willing to stand and deliver to young people on a daily basis. It's vulnerable.
yeah. And we are vulnerable. We have vulnerabilities in our home life and also in our work life. And sometimes those things cross over. Like, we inherently believe that like who you are as an educator and who you are as a person are intricately woven.
Yeah.
And that we want to see who you are. And that's part of being vulnerable, is being willing to share like elements of yourself and your personality and all those kind of things with students. But also knowing that our students also have so much going on. A few episodes ago, we spoke about this iceberg thing, that what we see on the surface is like nothing compared to all the things going on underneath, and our vulnerability really sits in that space. But what I love about the iceberg analogy when we talk about vulnerability is that we actually can see vulnerability taking place. Yeah. Because normally when someone is feeling vulnerable or vulnerability comes up and that sense of uncertainty appears, something happens and someone will do something that can give us information that they may be feeling vulnerable. And I know for all of us, like we've had real big chats, real big DMs about our.
We have gone to the length.
We have really gone to the lengths and to really understand what it is that we do when we feel vulnerable, because we know that understanding that really helps us to support the young people that we get to work with.
Yeah. And I think this also really connects to our episode on behaviour management. And, I really believe that so often sometimes we will experience some behaviours from students as a mask for their vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that's exactly something we'll be diving into today. And I think what we're going to unpack is, I know for all three of us, it's certainly been a real game changer understanding this concept.
For both ourselves and also one another as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a team setting.
Yeah. And for young people. And understanding that, at the end of the day, like when we are feeling vulnerable, there's a need there. And how do we help ourselves meet that need? And how do we help our students meet that need?
And so in Youth Engagement Project, that's what Amanda and I do. I don't know if I've shared this on the podcast, but my partner the other day asked me, he was like, I just feel like you really need to get a hobby. I'm like, so what? He said, you don't have any hobbies. And I realized in that moment,
Welcome.
I know, but I reflected in that moment that what we do and what we get to do now in Youth Engagement Project, like, was our hobby.
Yeah.
And yes, it was a really cool moment where I was like offended. I'm like, I have so many hobbies but I realized that now what I was doing in my spare time is now what we get to do every day.
Yeah.
But I was reflecting on one of the things that we do, and when we run a lot of facilitation training. So we work with youth organisations that go into schools and deliver content and programs and help them to do that in the most effective way.
And to support enhancing their engagement.
Yeah. And also we're working directly with teachers and working with schools to deliver professional development. And one of the concepts that we teach in both of those spaces is something that we have coined the vulnerability guard, and we would love to, I guess, unpack that a little bit. I know, Wil, it's something that, Wylar's found really useful as an org, and for all of us personally to just, I think, understand more about our own vulnerability and also the vulnerability of young people and how we can work with them, in that space.
And it's one of the moments of when you realize it, you're like, oh, it makes so much sense. And now I have to face it.
Yeah.
Totally.
But I also think, there's such a tendency, if anyone listening is anything like me, when those vulnerabilities come up for us personally, our inclination is to lean out. Yeah. And what we know and what we have spoken about as well previously on the podcast is that vulnerability is the gateway for creativity, for innovation, for connection, for relationships. And so I think bringing this model in that I feel like Skye's about to
I could do it. Yeah, sure.
about to paint a picture for us, bringing this model in supports us to go there.
So we all picture just a blank piece of paper. And on that blank piece of paper,
A4?
White A4, A3 if you really want, up to you.
No.
White piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, you see a stick figure appears and a circle appears around this stick figure. However, the circle doesn't go around the whole person. The circle kind of goes, so it's just the head of the stick figure popping out of the top of the circle. Okay. Everything else that is...
So I've got my stick torso, stick arms and stick legs inside the circle.
And the head is popping out.
My stick head is popping out.
Exactly right.
Them big balls that inflate and people run in them?
Oh, I can't think of what that's called. But yes, I know what you're talking about.
Just a head at the middle.
Or like there's a game where you play soccer in those balls.
But there's just someone trying to get out and their head's just out.
Exactly that. So picture that stick figure version, and then we're going to draw a little like love heart on that person's chest as well, which is going to be inside of the circle. So this circle represents what we call the vulnerability guard. And this is something that every single person has, like on the planet, this vulnerability guard. And the vulnerability guard is exactly that. It's a guard because when we feel vulnerable, when we have that emotional uncertainty or risk comes up, this guard appears to try and help keep our hearts safe, which sit inside of that guard. But what you'll notice about this picture is that the head pops out the top. And that's because we can go through life and have a completely intellectual experience of the world around us and not have an experience of being connected to our heart, which is where our vulnerability sits. And we just, our heads pop around and we can have conversations and we can interact and talk with each other, but it's just an intellectual experience of the world.
And for me, are we sharing ours? I don't know.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
You can go for it.
When I discovered it made so much sense because I think that in society everyone defines vulnerability or whatever it is, but reality is that the way that vulnerability really shows up and how you know that you're vulnerable is when these guards show up. So for me...
And so if I may just quickly preface...
Cliffhanger.
That the...
Cliffhanger, hang on. Let's just unpack that model a tiny bit.
Can we just quickly preface that the circle, the guard, it's a protective instinct. So it shows up to protect ourselves. And how it shows up is often through a behavior. So for you...
Which is what we were talking about earlier. It's like this is how we can identify vulnerability in other people and in ourselves because we become familiar with the behavior that shows up when we experience a sense of vulnerability.
Yeah.
And...
What might yours be, Wilson?
Is yours... Oh my gosh, yours is coming up.
Yeah, it is.
Are you okay?
Mine is evidently humour. And I don't know what just happened. It came up real strongly. And I was like, yeah, I'll share. Then all of a sudden, let's start making jokes.
Ooh, and so how does humour serve you? Because when it comes up to protect us. And so the concept is our being is protecting us from the vulnerability. So how does humour serve you in those moments?
Well, I think I always convinced myself that if someone bullied me and I owned that story and I laughed about it with them, then I win.
That sounds really healthy.
And how it serves me, I don't know, but I deflect's pretty good.
Yeah.
Side swipe.
So that's
Stop making me talk.
Sorry, that's okay. We'll move on. But if I'm permission to expand on what you just shared. So I feel like how it serves you is by deflecting the vulnerable moment.
Yeah.
You use humour to deflect the vulnerable moment.
To get out of sitting in it because you feel that sense of uncertainty or emotional risk or whatever it might be. I can share mine.
Okay.
And I'm really just going to mine's also humour. No. No, I just am laughing because I'm going to throw my partner under the bus again this episode. Second time. Shout out to the love of my life. But my vulnerability guard shows up as getting busy. So my behaviour is getting busy. So when I feel vulnerable, whether it's in a work sense or in my personal life, instead of having the conversation or doing the vulnerable thing or sitting in that risk or that uncertainty, instead, I'll just be like, man, I have this hectic to-do list. I'm just going to get all this stuff done around the house.
I've got to colour code my socks.
I've got to
colour code the books.
I've got that load of washing to do, and then there's the dishes. And then after that, I might just clean my windows. Oh, and then the neighbours' windows because that sounds really whatever.
So I don't have time today to have this conversation.
Yeah. And that's really me pushing away wanting to be vulnerable. And I do that through, getting busy and basically making myself busy enough that I can't be vulnerable in that moment. And my partner, bless his cotton socks, knows this about me quite well. And so we'll kind of make a bit of fun of it and we'll be like, oh, yeah. And after that, we'll just sit outside and then we'll watch the grass grow and that'll take another week and, or whatever it might be. But I love it because that humour and that play, which is he doesn't know this, of course, but what he's actually doing is also using pace to get me out of that moment. He's using play to break that up for me.
Absolutely.
But he uses that and it kind of snaps me out of it. And because I know what a vulnerability guard is, I know what it means when I do it and I know my own behaviours, it's just a reminder in that moment of oh yeah, I'm maybe being silly and I am safe and I am able to sit in my vulnerability right now.
So I guess, thank you both for sharing. So I guess a few important things to note is that, through sharing this, our wish is not that you now try and vanquish your guard. And in fact, we would never and could never ask that of anyone. And we would never stand in front of young people and seek that of them either. We have these protective behaviours, protective instincts for a reason, and we deserve to have them, and that's okay. I think a powerful thing to realize is that so often, you know, when we're faced with uncertainty or risk or emotional exposure, so often we will guard ourselves. And when that guard shows up, it shows up in a behavior.
Yeah.
And, you know, just listening to Wil and Skye, you know, we might be having thoughts or feelings around maybe we're picturing someone in our family or a partner or someone in our class, maybe a student, or maybe we're reflecting on ourselves and we're going, oh my gosh, this thing, like this is what I do every time.
And I think it's really important to note that whatever the guard is for you, and we can have multiple, it's not just one guard, right? We might have a few different things that show up for us at different points, but that guard usually actually pushes away the very thing that we need in that moment. So when I feel vulnerable, the thing that I want is to feel connection. The thing that I want is to know that I matter, to know that I belong, to know that I'm safe, whatever it might be. And by getting busy or cracking jokes and forcing that moment away or delaying the vulnerability, it actually pushes away connection. It pushes away the thing that I might need in that moment. So how does this relate to education and how does this relate to the classroom? I feel like that's important to chat about.
Super important. And we'll also unpack a few more of those behaviours as well, just quickly. So how it relates is, I guess, understanding A, that it shows up in a behaviour, and B, that behaviour symbolises a need. That's a really powerful thing to know here, that behaviour symbolises a need. So if it's for ourselves, you know, if we are really aware in those moments, we can ask ourselves or catch ourselves and check ourselves, what do I need right now? And if it's happening with someone else in our world, we can ask the same. And I feel like in a classroom perspective as educators or from a program perspective, knowing that it is vulnerable to learn. It is vulnerable to try new things. It is vulnerable to be creative and innovative and grow. And we ask that of our students every day. So what that means is we absolutely 100% will be seeing guards show up. And those behaviors, you know, you might be picturing, for example, your class clown, or you might be picturing your beautiful young one that withdraws a little as their guard, or you might be picturing
the people pleaser is like another really big one that shows up in schools. Like, you know, I hate using that label like teacher's pet, but everyone understands what we mean when we talk about that. But that student who is constantly looking or seeking approval and that kind of thing, that's another guard, another form of a guard.
Well, that dependency, maybe there's a student that gets incredibly dependent on an assistant teacher or the teacher or another student, or, you know, the avoidance piece, just going into absolute and complete avoidance. Self-deprecation is another huge one. And I feel like we see this skyrocket in high school, you know, when we get vulnerable, well, we'll just put ourselves down. And that will make
so much easier.
So much easier than feeling it all. And so as educators, when we witness this in our spaces, to know that A, it's never personal. It is always a reflection of what is happening in that young person and with that young person. And B, to know that there is a need in that moment. Now, this doesn't mean it's our responsibility to meet that need all the time and every time, but having that awareness is important because it helps us lean into empathy versus judgment, curiosity versus judgment. And you know, maybe we can even approach that student and get curious, maybe use PACE to kind of consider what the need is.
And if you're like, what's PACE? Go back and listen to our episode on behavior management. We went through it. But yeah, really, really important. I think acknowledging our own vulnerabilities and our students' vulnerabilities is really a path forward for connection and helping to manage and create a culture and an environment in our schools, in our homes or whatever, where we really lean into the strength that comes with vulnerability and the importance of knowing that's there for a reason. It's a protective thing. It's not our job to pull it down, but it is our job to be really respectful and mindful of those vulnerabilities every individual has.
Yeah. And you may have been sitting here for the entire episode wondering, what is mine? The time is for you to reflect.
And you can unclench your butt cheeks and go about your day.
And before we go, I just feel like off air before we started recording, Wil, you made a really good point around, you know, we know the power of vulnerability and we're incorporating that in our workplaces and our classrooms more and more. And I don't think incorporating, I just think acknowledging is acknowledgement
important.
Is what's increasing. Yeah. And, you know, Wil, you made a really good point around, well, what if we have a leadership team or a principal or you know, whatever that is not vulnerable or doesn't acknowledge the benefit of vulnerability. And I guess my feeling is that what is happening with that rejection of vulnerability is possibly the guard of those individuals. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that we can't, you know, continue to increase our acknowledgement and our awareness around it, because it's a fact and it's present. So
go out there, tap into that for you, increase your awareness of what's going on for people around you and for yourself. And hopefully you've learned something as a takeaway. As always, please hit us up in the DMs. Like if you want to chat about vulnerability, if you want to talk about this more and what it means for you, there's only so much we can cover in such short episodes, but hopefully this is something we'll revisit at another time.
Yeah.
But it's been an absolute pleasure as always.
We shall see you next week.
We are Podclass. Bye.
Bye.
See you then.
I'll be here for you, 'cause you're there for them too.